In 1974, a researcher named Geza Teleki was sitting in the forest at Gombe Stream Research Center in Tanzania when he watched 8 male chimpanzees move in silence through the trees toward the southern boundary of their territory. They moved differently than they moved during foraging. No vocalizations, no branch shaking, no display. They moved the way something moves when it does not want to be heard. What happened next took 14 minutes. When it was over, a chimpanzee named Godi from the neighboring Kahama community was dead, and the 8 males were gone. It was the first directly observed lethal attack between chimpanzee communities in the history of primatology. And it was the opening event of what researchers would later call the 4-year war. Subscribe right now. Hit that button before this video goes any further. It costs you nothing, and it makes this channel possible. Drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. We read every single one. The 4-year war at Gombe lasted from 1974 to 1978. In that time, the Kasakila community, which was the group that Jane Goodall had been studying since the early 1960s, systematically killed every adult male in the neighboring Kahama community that had split from the Kasakila group 3 years earlier. The kills were not accidental encounters. They were not defensive responses to aggression from the Kahama group. They were hunts. The Kasakela males identified individual Kahama males who were alone or in small groups, tracked them, and attacked them with a ferocity and a persistence that left no possibility of survival for the victims. The attacks were carried out by groups of 3 to 8 males who held the victim down, bit him, and beat him for periods of 10 to 20 minutes until he was too injured to move. Most victims died within days of the attack. By 1978, the Kahama community had ceased to exist. The Kasakela community had expanded its range into the territory that the Kahama males had held, absorbing the females who survived and the land that the males had defended. The 4-year war was, by the definition that the research community eventually adopted, the first documented case of warfare in a non-human species. The interpretation of what happened at Gombe took years to develop and is still contested in its details, but the broad outline of the behavioral logic is now well established. The chimpanzee community at Gombe, and at every other long-term research site where intergroup violence has been documented, maintains its territory through a system of boundary patrols that are behaviorally distinct from ordinary ranging. During a patrol, the males of the community move together in the direction of the territorial boundary, often in single file, in silence, monitoring the environment for signs of neighboring community males. The behavioral change that marks the transition from foraging to patrolling has been documented in enough detail to be recognizable. The males stop vocalizing, they stop feeding, they move in a coordinated direction, and they display the heightened vigilance and tension that researchers describe as the characteristic behavioral signature of patrol mode. The patrol reaches the boundary zone, and the males spend time monitoring the signs of neighboring community activity, the calls they can hear, the nests they find, the trails that show recent movement. If they encounter signs of a large neighboring group, they typically withdraw. If they encounter signs of a lone male or a small subgroup, the assessment of the numerical advantage shifts, and the patrol behavior transitions into something closer to a hunt. The assessment of numerical advantage is one of the most striking cognitive features of chimpanzee intergroup aggression, because it requires the patrolling males to evaluate not just the immediate sensory information about the neighboring male's location, but an estimate of the relative group sizes that the available evidence supports. The research on this assessment behavior, which has been conducted through the analysis of the conditions that predict escalation versus withdrawal in intergroup encounters, has found that the ratio of attacker to defender numbers is the single strongest predictor of whether a patrol escalates to a lethal attack. When the patrolling group outnumbers the encountered neighbors by 3 to 1 or more, attacks are far more likely than when the numerical advantage is smaller or absent. The chimpanzee groups that initiate lethal attacks are groups that have made, in some sense that the behavior implies, a calculation about the odds. The mechanics of the lethal attack, which have been documented in enough cases across enough research sites to establish a consistent pattern, involve a combination of behaviors that are not used in within-group aggression and that appear to be specifically organized for the function of killing a member of an outside group. The victim is held down by one or more attackers, while others deliver bites to the face, the throat, the hands, and the genitals. The biting and the beating are sustained well beyond what would be required to drive the victim away, and they are directed at anatomical locations whose injury is maximally debilitating. The victim's attempts to vocalize and call for help are suppressed by the attackers, and the attack is sustained even after the victim has stopped resisting. The behavioral description of the lethal attack reads, in the clinical language of the research literature, like the description of an organized killing, and the researchers who have witnessed these attacks describe them with the quality of disturbance that reading produces. The Ngogo chimpanzee community in Kibale National Park, Uganda, which is the largest known chimpanzee community ever studied and which has been monitored by David Watts and John Mitani since the 1990s, provided the most extensive documentation of intergroup violence in chimpanzee research before the Gombe data had been supplemented by comparable datasets from other sites. The Ngogo community, which at its peak contained over 200 individuals and more than 25 adult males, conducted intergroup patrols and lethal attacks on neighboring communities across a 10-year period that was documented in detail by the research team. The outcome of this decade of intergroup aggression was that the Ngogo community expanded its territory by approximately 22%, acquiring land from the communities whose males had been killed or driven out by the Ngogo patrols. The expansion was documented in real time by the research team that was mapping the community's ranging patterns, and it provided the clearest evidence yet available that the intergroup aggression of chimpanzees produces territorial gain that translates into access to food resources and into reproductive opportunities for the community's females. The connection between territorial gain and reproductive success, which is the evolutionary payoff that the research has proposed as the ultimate explanation for the intergroup aggression, was documented in the Ngogo case by the analysis of the correlation between the territory expansion and the subsequent birth rate in the community. In the years following the territory expansion, the Ngogo community's birth rate increased in a way that was statistically associated with the expanded territory's greater food resource availability. The females with access to the expanded territory showed higher reproductive rates than the females whose ranges were in the older, more established parts of the community's range. The killing of the neighboring males, in other words, paid off in the currency that natural selection measures, more offspring surviving to reproductive age. The question of whether chimpanzee intergroup violence is best understood as a form of warfare, and what that understanding implies about the evolutionary origins of human warfare, is one of the most contested questions in the behavioral sciences, and the debate has produced a body of literature that is as interesting for what it reveals about the sociology of science as for what it reveals about chimpanzee behavior. The researchers who have argued most strongly for the warfare interpretation, who include Richard Wrangham of Harvard and his collaborators, have proposed that the intergroup violence of chimpanzees and the intergroup violence of humans share an evolutionary origin in the common ancestor of the two species, and that the behavioral psychology of human warfare, including the coalition formation, the assessment of numerical advantage, the targeting of males, and the territorial motivation, is a product of the same evolutionary history that produced the equivalent behaviors in chimpanzees. The researchers who have argued against the warfare interpretation, or who have proposed alternative explanations for the intergroup violence, have focused on the environmental conditions that correlate with elevated rates of chimpanzee intergroup aggression. The hypothesis proposed by Robert Walker and colleagues that the intergroup violence of chimpanzees at research sites is elevated by the provisioning and the habitat modification that the research programs themselves produce, has been the most sustained challenge to the warfare interpretation. The data from sites where chimpanzees have not been provisioned with food and where the habitat is less modified shows lower rates of intergroup violence than the data from Gombe, where provisioning was used to habituate the chimpanzees to human observers in the early years of Goodall's research. The debate about the role of provisioning in elevating aggression rates at Gombe has not been resolved, and it continues to influence how researchers interpret the significance of the violence that the research programs have documented. The cross-site analysis of intergroup violence rates that Wilson, Wrangham, and their collaborators published in 2014, which pooled data from 18 chimpanzee study sites and several bonobo sites, addressed the provisioning question directly by analyzing whether the sites with provisioning showed higher rates of intergroup violence than the sites without provisioning after controlling for other variables. The analysis found that provisioning did not significantly predict intergroup violence rates across sites, but that the size of the local community and the density of the chimpanzee population in the study area did predict violence rates. The analysis was interpreted as supporting the adaptive interpretation of chimpanzee intergroup violence and challenging the environmental disturbance hypothesis. But the debate it generated in the subsequent literature demonstrated that the question of what drives chimpanzee intergroup violence is not settled by any single analysis. The female behavior during intergroup violence is one of the dimensions of the phenomenon that the research has documented less thoroughly than the male behavior, partly because females are less involved in the patrols and the lethal attacks, and partly because the research focus on the dramatic events of the attacks has sometimes overshadowed the less immediately dramatic but equally important behavior of the females before, during, and after intergroup encounters. The females of a community whose males are conducting a patrol typically remain in the core of the community's range, away from the boundary zones where the patrols operate. But the females are not passive in the intergroup dynamics. The transfer of females between communities, which occurs regularly in chimpanzee populations and which is one of the mechanisms by which chimpanzee communities exchange genetic material, is influenced by the intergroup competitive dynamics in ways that connect the violence to the reproductive biology of the species in a direct way. The bonobo comparison, which this channel has addressed in the series on bonobo behavior, provides the most important contrast to the chimpanzee intergroup violence data. Bonobos, who are as closely related to humans as chimpanzees are, and who share the chimpanzee's basic social organization of male philopatric communities with female transfer, do not show the lethal intergroup violence that chimpanzees show. The intergroup encounters of bonobos, which have been documented at research sites in the Democratic Republic of Congo, are characterized by affiliative behavior between members of different communities, including the socio-sexual behaviors that bonobos use to reduce tension in all social contexts, rather than by the hostility and the threat of lethal violence that characterizes chimpanzee intergroup encounters. The bonobo's absence of intergroup lethal violence in a species that is otherwise very similar to the chimpanzee is one of the most important data points in the debate about the evolutionary origins of human warfare, because it demonstrates that the common ancestor of chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans did not necessarily show the chimpanzee pattern of intergroup violence, and that the chimpanzee pattern may be a derived feature of the chimpanzee lineage, rather than a shared ancestral feature of all three lineages. The communities of chimpanzees that are conducting patrols tonight, in the forests of Tanzania and Uganda and Ivory Coast, where the long-term research programs are monitoring them, are doing something that the research has spent 50 years working to understand, and that the understanding has made more rather than less complex. They are not simply aggressive animals following instinctive programs for killing neighbors. They are cognitively sophisticated social animals making assessments of numerical advantage, coordinating group behavior through communication systems whose signals are subtle enough to be missed by casual observation, and pursuing outcomes, territorial expansion, and the resources that territorial expansion provides, that the behavioral logic of the situation predicts and that the long-term data confirms. The 4-year war at Gombe was the first evidence that this behavior existed. The 50 years of research that followed has established that it is a consistent feature of chimpanzee social life, present across populations and across study sites, and connected to the reproductive biology of the species in ways that make its evolutionary maintenance comprehensible. What it means for understanding the origins of human violence is a question the field is still asking. Sleep well. The acoustic dimension of chimpanzee intergroup encounters is one of the most studied aspects of the phenomenon, because the vocalizations that chimpanzees produce during intergroup interactions carry information about the identity and the number of the vocalizing individuals and about the emotional state of the community members who hear them. The pant hoot, which is the long-distance call that chimpanzees use for communication across the forest, is produced by community members during intergroup encounters in ways that communicate information about the caller's location and identity to community members who are out of visual range. The silencing of pant hoots that characterizes the patrol mode is itself a behavioral signal that researchers have learned to read as an indicator that the chimpanzees are in intergroup patrol mode rather than in ordinary foraging mode, because the behavioral logic of the silence is clear. A group that is trying to approach a neighboring group without being detected does not vocalize. The long-term research programs that have produced the understanding of chimpanzee intergroup violence described in this video have also produced a body of knowledge about the individual variation in participation in patrols and attacks that illuminates the social dynamics of the behavior within the community. Not all adult males in a community participate equally in intergroup aggression. The highest-ranking males, whose dominance within the community is already established, participate in patrols at higher rates than lower-ranking males. The coalitional relationships between males within the community predict their joint participation in patrols. Males who are close social allies within the community are more likely to patrol and to attack together than males whose within-community relationships are more distant. The intergroup violence is not simply an expression of a generalized aggressiveness in the male members of the community. It is a socially organized behavior whose participants are determined by the social structure of the community and by the individual relationships that structure produces. The injuries sustained by chimpanzees during intergroup attacks, which have been documented through the medical records of the long-term research program's veterinary monitoring systems, illuminate the physical intensity of the attacks in clinical terms. The bite wounds documented in attack survivors include deep puncture wounds to the face and the throat, tearing wounds to the hands and the forearms that result from defensive gestures, and in some cases, injuries to the eyes and the ears that reflect the sustained and directed nature of the biting behavior during the attacks. The survivors of attacks who have been treated by the veterinary programs at Gombe and Kibale have included individuals with injuries severe enough to have been fatal without veterinary intervention, and the comparison of the injury profiles of attack survivors with the injury profiles of individuals who died from their attack injuries illuminates the line between survivable and lethal injury in a way that the behavioral description of the attacks alone cannot convey. The relationship between the intergroup violence and the within-group social dynamics of the chimpanzee community is one of the dimensions of the phenomenon that the research has addressed most productively in the years following the initial documentation of the 4-year war. The hypothesis that intergroup violence functions as a mechanism for male coalition maintenance within the community, as well as a mechanism for territorial competition between communities, has been developed from the observation that the shared experience of patrolling and attacking together appears to strengthen the social bonds between the male participants. The behavioral indicators of within-community social cohesion, including grooming rates, coalition support in within-community conflicts, and the proximity maintenance between individuals, show elevated values in the male pairs and groups that have shared patrol and attack experiences, compared to male pairs that have not. The violence that the research has documented as directed outward toward neighboring communities may therefore be simultaneously directed inward, toward the maintenance of the social structure that makes the violence possible. The geographical distribution of intergroup violence across the chimpanzees' range, which extends from West Africa through Central Africa to East Africa, shows a consistency in the basic behavioral pattern of male coalition patrols and lethal attacks on neighboring community males that supports the interpretation of the behavior as a stable feature of chimpanzee social organization rather than a local or population-level anomaly. The research programs at Gombe in Tanzania, at Kibale in Uganda, at Tai Forest in Ivory Coast, at Bosu in Guinea, and at Bwindi in Uganda have all documented intergroup violence in the communities they monitor, and the behavioral descriptions from these geographically and ecologically diverse sites show a consistency that the research community has interpreted as evidence that the behavior is part of the chimpanzee's behavioral repertoire, in the same way that within community dominance competition and cooperative hunting are part of that repertoire. The 50 years of research on chimpanzee intergroup violence that followed Geza Teleki's observation in 1974 have produced a body of knowledge that has permanently changed the understanding of what chimpanzees are and what the study of chimpanzee behavior reveals about the evolutionary origins of human social behavior. The behavior is real. It is consistent across populations and research sites. It is organized in ways that require cognitive sophistication and social coordination. And it produces outcomes, territorial gain, and the resources that territorial gain provides that are meaningful in the evolutionary terms of reproductive success. What it means for understanding human warfare is a question that the field is actively debating, with some researchers arguing for a deep evolutionary homology between chimpanzee and human intergroup violence, and others arguing that the ecological and social context of human warfare is different enough from the chimpanzee's context that the behavioral similarity is more superficial than the homology argument suggests. The debate is productive, the behavior that motivated it is real, and the forest where it happens is full of chimpanzees conducting patrols tonight that the research programs are working to understand with the same urgency that the behavior's implications for human self-understanding deserve. Sleep well. The individual chimpanzees who participated in the 4-year war at Gombe are known to the research record by name because Goodall's practice of naming the individual animals in her study population has been adopted by the long-term research programs that followed her lead. Fegan, the alpha male who led the Kasakela community during the war years. Jomeo, one of the most active participants in the attacks on Kahama males. Godi, the first Kahama male to be killed. Day, whose death in 1977 effectively ended the Kahama community's existence as an independent social unit. These are not abstract data points. They are individuals whose lives were documented across years by the researchers who knew them, and whose deaths are part of the research record in the same way that their births and their social relationships are part of it. The 4-year war was conducted by individuals, with individual histories and individual relationships, and the research that documented it did so at the level of individuals whose names the primatology literature preserves. Sleep well. The question of intent that underlies the debate about whether chimpanzee intergroup violence constitutes warfare is a question about the cognitive architecture of a behavior that looks purposeful, without the behavioral science having yet developed the tools to establish whether the purposefulness is genuine or apparent. When a group of chimpanzee males silences itself, moves in a coordinated direction toward a territorial boundary, waits for a moment when the numerical advantage is favorable, and then attacks a lone neighboring male with sustained, directed violence, the behavior looks intentional in the sense that it looks like the product of a goal-directed cognitive process rather than a reflexive response to a stimulus. Whether the appearance of intentionality reflects a genuine cognitive representation of a goal, the death or incapacitation of a neighboring male, or whether it reflects a simpler behavioral program that produces the same outcome without the intervening cognitive representation, is a question that the behavioral evidence alone cannot answer, and that the neuroscience of chimpanzee cognition has not yet addressed with the tools that would be required to resolve it. The connection between the chimpanzee's intergroup violence and the within-community social learning that transmits behavioral patterns across generations illuminates the degree to which the behavior is culturally as well as genetically transmitted. The young males who participate in their first patrols alongside experienced adult males are learning the behavioral sequence of the patrol through observation and participation in a way that parallels the social learning of other complex behavioral patterns in chimpanzee communities. The variation in patrol frequency and attack rate between communities at different research sites, which is one of the pieces of evidence that the researchers who favor the environmental disturbance hypothesis have cited in support of their interpretation, is also consistent with the cultural transmission hypothesis. Communities whose males have established a high patrol frequency through the reinforcement of successful territorial expansion are communities that transmit this behavioral pattern to the next generation through social learning. while communities in less competitive environments may transmit a lower patrol frequency and a correspondingly lower attack rate. The research on chimpanzee intergroup violence has produced, as a secondary effect, a substantial improvement in the methods available for studying social behavior in natural populations of great apes and other social animals. The longitudinal data collection methods that allow the same individuals to be tracked across years of behavioral observation, the genetic sampling methods that allow the parentage and the relatedness of individuals to be established without invasive procedures, and the acoustic recording methods that allow the vocalizations of individuals to be identified and analyzed in the context of intergroup encounters, are all methods that were developed or refined in the context of the long-term chimpanzee research programs and that have been applied to the study of social behavior in a wide range of species. The science of chimpanzee warfare has made the science of animal social behavior better in ways that extend far beyond the question of chimpanzee violence itself. The night falls on the forests of Gombe and Kibale and Tai, and the other places where the research programs are monitoring chimpanzee communities that have been patrolling their boundaries for generations. The males who are resting now after today's foraging will wake before dawn and assess the situation of their community in terms of the signs of neighboring community activity that the previous days have provided. Some mornings the assessment will produce a patrol, some patrols will produce an encounter, some encounters will produce an attack. The mathematics of these probabilities, distributed across the communities monitored by the research programs and extrapolated to the unmonitored communities that constitute the majority of the world's remaining chimpanzee population, produce a picture of intergroup violence at a frequency and at a scale that the research has been working to characterize for 50 years. What Geza Teleki witnessed in 1974 was not an anomaly. It was a window into a behavioral system that the research has been looking through ever since, and that the looking has made more not less complex. Sleep well. The data from the cross-site analysis published in 2014 established that intergroup killing in chimpanzees occurs at a rate of approximately 0. 34 killings per 100 chimpanzee years at risk across the sites studied, a rate that is substantially higher than the equivalent rate in bonobos, which is 0 in the observational record, and which is comparable to the homicide rates in some small-scale human societies whose data on intergroup violence has been incorporated into the comparative analyses that connect the chimpanzee and human literatures. The rate is not the same as the human warfare rate in any direct comparison, because the comparison requires adjustments for body mass, group size, and the definition of death in warfare versus death in a killing. But the order of magnitude comparison is one that the researchers who have made it describe as meaningful rather than coincidental. The rate at which chimpanzees kill members of neighboring communities is not a residual of rare, anomalous events. It is a measurable, cross-site consistent property of chimpanzee social life, the political dimension of chimpanzee intergroup violence, which involves the management of within-community alliances in the context of intergroup competition, is one of the most interesting and least resolved questions that the research has opened. The alpha male who leads a community with a high patrol rate is an alpha who has, in some sense that the behavior implies, organized the community's males around a competitive strategy that produces territorial gain. The males who participate most actively in patrols are the males who are most invested in the alpha's coalition and whose social status within the community is most dependent on the success of the intergroup competitive strategy. The politics of the within-community dominance hierarchy and the politics of the intergroup competitive strategy are connected in ways that the research is still working to characterize, and the connection between them is one of the places where the behavioral complexity of chimpanzee social life is most visible. The world's remaining wild chimpanzee population, estimated at between 170,000 and 300,000 individuals distributed across the forests of West and Central Africa, is a population that is conducting the intergroup competition described in this video, at a frequency and at a scale that the research programs can monitor only in the small fraction of communities that have been habituated to human observers. The unmonitored communities, which constitute the vast majority of the world's chimpanzees, are conducting patrols and attacks whose outcomes are unknown to the research community, and whose contribution to the total picture of chimpanzee intergroup violence can only be estimated from the data that the monitored sites provide. The 4-year war that Goodall's research program documented was one event in one community in one forest. The full scope of what is happening across the species range is something the research has only glimpsed. Sleep well. The individual that Geza Teleki watched die in 1974 was a chimpanzee named Godi, who had been known to the Gombe research program since the early years of Goodall's study. He was not a threat. He was not attacking. He was alone, and the group that found him was large enough that the assessment of numerical advantage was unambiguous. The attack lasted 14 minutes. The research record preserves its details with the clinical precision of observational science, and the clinical precision does not diminish the reality of what happened in that forest in 1974. A member of a community killed a member of a neighboring community in an organized, coordinated attack that was the opening event of a 4-year campaign that ended with the complete elimination of the neighboring community. The science that has spent 50 years trying to understand why has not yet produced a final answer, but it has produced a detailed, evidence-based account of how, and the how is one of the most important and most disturbing findings that the study of chimpanzee behavior has generated. Sleep well. The Thai forest chimpanzees of Ivory Coast, studied by Christopher Boesch and his colleagues since the 1970s, have provided some of the most important comparative data on chimpanzee intergroup violence outside the East African research sites where the behavior was first documented. The Thai community's intergroup encounters show the same behavioral pattern of male coalition patrols and lethal attacks that the Gombe and Kibale data established, but in a rainforest habitat whose ecological conditions differ from the woodland savanna mosaic of Gombe, in ways that have been used to test the ecological hypotheses about what drives the behavior. The consistency of the intergroup violence pattern across the very different ecological conditions of Thai forest and Gombe has been interpreted as support for the hypothesis that the behavior is a stable feature of the species rather than a response to the conditions of any single habitat or research site. The ethical dimensions of studying chimpanzee intergroup violence, which arise from the same source as the ethical dimensions of studying any disturbing behavior in a cognitively sophisticated species, have been engaged with by the researchers who have devoted their careers to this work in ways that reflect the genuine difficulty of the position they occupy. The researcher who watches a lethal attack and does not intervene because the intervention would compromise the naturalness of the behavior being studied, and because the attack is over too quickly for intervention to be practically possible in most cases, is a researcher who has made a decision about the relative priority of scientific knowledge and individual welfare that is not made comfortably and that is not made without awareness of what it costs. The research community's engagement with these ethical questions is part of the scientific literature on chimpanzee behavior, and the engagement is honest about the tensions that the research produces. The conservation implication of the intergroup violence data is one that has not been fully absorbed into the conservation planning for chimpanzee populations, but that has practical consequences for how small, isolated populations are managed. The chimpanzee community that is too small to field the male coalition that effective territorial defense requires is a community that is vulnerable to territorial displacement by neighboring communities, and the displacement of a small community from its territory by a larger neighboring community can effectively eliminate the smaller community as a social unit, even without the direct killing of its members. The fragmentation of chimpanzee habitat into small isolated patches that cannot support large communities creates conditions that the intergroup violence data suggests are particularly dangerous for the long-term viability of the communities in the smaller patches. The conservation planning that does not account for this dimension of chimpanzee social biology is planning that may underestimate the minimum viable population size for isolated chimpanzee communities. The chimpanzees that Geza Teleki was studying in 1974 were the same chimpanzees that Jane Goodall had been studying since 1960. They were animals he knew by name, whose individual histories and social relationships he had been documenting for years before the morning that he watched them kill Godi. The encounter changed the direction of primatology in a way that the behavioral science of the time was not prepared for, and that the implications of which are still being worked out. The animal that Goodall had described as remarkably similar to humans in its social and emotional life turned out to be similar to humans in this dimension too, capable of organized, coordinated, lethal violence against members of an outside group. The finding was disturbing. The research that followed it has been some of the most productive and most important work in the behavioral sciences, and the chimpanzees at Gombe are still there, in the same forest, doing what the research has been documenting for 50 years. Sleep well. The intergroup killing rate that the cross-site analysis established, 0. 34 killings per 100 chimpanzee years, translates into a rate that, when applied to the estimated world chimpanzee population of between 170,000 and 300,000 individuals, suggests that intergroup killings are occurring in the wild chimpanzee population at a rate of hundreds per year. Most of these events are never observed by human researchers because the vast majority of wild chimpanzee communities have not been habituated to human observers, and their behavior is accessible only through the signs they leave in the environment. The bodies of chimpanzees killed in intergroup attacks are rarely found because the attackers do not leave the body behind in a location where it would be easily discovered, and because the forest environment decomposes biological material quickly. The full scale of chimpanzee intergroup violence is therefore almost certainly larger than the research record reflects, and the understanding of the behavior is built on data from communities that may not be representative of the species as a whole. The researchers who have spent careers at the Gombe, Kibale and Tai research sites describe the forests where they work, with a quality of attention and personal investment that reflects the years they have spent in those places, following the same individuals and recording the same behavioral patterns that the science requires continuous documentation of. The forest at Gombe that Goodall first entered in 1960 is the same forest that the research program continues to monitor today, more than 60 years later. The chimpanzees living there today are the descendants of the individuals that Goodall named and followed and wrote about in the accounts that introduced the world to the behavioral complexity of this species. The 4-year war happened there. The research that it generated has produced the science described in this video. And the forest continues to be what it has always been, a place where chimpanzees are doing what chimpanzees do, in the darkness and the light, watched now by the cameras and the researchers that have come after the original observers, adding to a record that is still being written. Sleep well. The dark truth of the 4-year war at Gombe is not simply that chimpanzees kill each other in organized, coordinated attacks, though they do. It is that the behavior makes evolutionary sense in exactly the same framework that evolutionary biologists use to understand adaptive behavior in any species. It produces outcomes that translate into reproductive success for the individuals who engage in it and for the communities that sustain it. The killing of Godi in 1974 was the first step in a process that resulted in the Kasakila community expanding its territory and increasing its access to food resources and to reproductive opportunities. The expansion was real. The resources were real. The reproductive gains were real. The behavior is maintained in the population because it is adaptive. In the cold arithmetic, that natural selection applies equally to the most disturbing and the most admirable behaviors that biology produces. That arithmetic does not justify the behavior. It explains it. And the explanation is one of the most important and most unsettling contributions that chimpanzee behavioral research has made to the scientific understanding of what we share with our closest living relatives. Sleep well. The behavioral signature of the patrol, which this video described early on as distinct from ordinary foraging movement, is the behavioral signature that the forest produces in any community that has reached the boundary of its territory and is assessing the competitive landscape on the other side. The silence, the single file, the heightened vigilance, the slow, deliberate movement through the dense vegetation at the boundary zone. These behaviors are recognizable to the researchers who have spent years watching chimpanzees move through the forest, and they are recognizable because they are consistently associated with the intergroup encounters that sometimes follow them. The forest at Gombe and Kibale and Tai is full of communities that are conducting patrols that the research programs are not witnessing. In the hours when the research teams are not in the field and in the areas that the research teams do not cover. What is happening in those patrols is what this video has described, because the behavior is consistent and because the consistency reflects the evolutionary logic that produces and maintains it. Sleep well. The science of chimpanzee warfare is not finished. The questions that the 4-year war opened in 1974 are still generating research, still generating debate, and still generating data from the long-term programs that have been monitoring chimpanzee communities for decades. The question of whether the behavior is best understood as warfare, as adaptive intergroup competition, as a cultural variable whose expression is shaped by ecological conditions, or as some combination of all three, is a question that the field is still working through with the tools that 50 years of methodological development have made available. What is not in question is that the behavior is real, that it is consistent, and that it is one of the most important and most consequential findings in the history of primatology. The forest at Gombe is still there, the chimpanzees are still there, and the research is still being done. Sleep well. The female chimpanzees whose ranges overlap with the boundary zones, that the males patrol show behavioral changes in the days following an intergroup encounter that the research has documented as indicators of elevated stress, including increased grooming rates, reduced foraging efficiency, and closer association with the adult males of the community. These behavioral changes suggest that the females are aware of the elevated intergroup tension that follows a boundary encounter, even if they are not direct participants in the patrol or the attack that the encounter may produce. The females' awareness of the competitive landscape of the territory and their behavioral responses to it are part of the social dimension of the intergroup violence that the focus on male behavior can obscure. And the research that has examined female behavioral responses to intergroup encounters is producing a fuller picture of how the violence shapes the social life of the entire community, not just the males who conduct the patrols. The DNA evidence from chimpanzee communities that have been genetically sampled has added a dimension to the understanding of intergroup violence that behavioral observation alone cannot provide. The paternity analysis of offspring born into communities where the research has documented the deaths of adult males reveals whether the killings of neighboring community males have produced changes in the paternity distribution of the births in the years following the killings, which would be the reproductive consequence that the evolutionary argument predicts. The data from these analyses is not yet comprehensive enough to produce definitive conclusions across sites, but the preliminary findings are consistent with the prediction. The expansion of a community's territory following the killing of neighboring males is associated with increased reproductive opportunities for the expanding community's males in the areas of the expanded territory. The evolutionary arithmetic of the intergroup violence, in other words, appears to work out in the direction that the adaptive interpretation predicts. The morning that Geza Teleki walked back to the Gombe research station after watching the attack on Godi, the world of primatology was different from the world it had been when he had left that morning. The finding he was carrying was a finding that would take years to be fully accepted and longer to be fully understood. But the direction it pointed was clear, even before the analysis and the debate that followed. Chimpanzees were capable of something that the science had assumed was uniquely human. The assumption was wrong. The implications of that wrongness are still being worked out in the research programs that are still monitoring the communities where the behavior occurs and in the scientific literature that the monitoring produces. What Geza Teleki saw in 1974 changed how we understand what chimpanzees are. It also changed how we understand what we are. Sleep well. The 22% territorial expansion that the Ngogo community achieved through a decade of lethal intergroup aggression is the clearest available demonstration of what chimpanzee intergroup violence produces at the community level. The land that the Ngogo males killed to acquire is land that their community's females now forage in, that their community's cubs now grow up in, and that the future generations of the Ngogo community will inherit as the baseline territory from which the next generation's intergroup competition will be conducted. The violence that produced the expansion is not remembered by the individuals who live in its consequences. But the consequences are real, and the land is there. And the chimpanzees on it are the beneficiaries of what the males of the previous decade did to acquire it. The arithmetic of territorial violence works the same way for chimpanzees as for every other species in whose behavioral repertoire it appears. Sleep well. The long view of chimpanzee intergroup violence, which the 50 years of systematic research have made possible, reveals a pattern that is stable enough to be predictable and complex enough to resist simple explanation. The communities that patrol most actively are not simply the most aggressive communities. They are the communities whose size, prey, availability, and social cohesion create the conditions in which active patrolling produces more gain than it costs. The communities that expand their territories are not simply the largest communities. They are the communities whose males have maintained the coalition cohesion and the patrol frequency that territory expansion requires over the years in which the neighboring communities' defenses were weakened. And the killings that drive the expansion are not simply expressions of aggression. They are the decisive events in a competitive process whose logic is territorial and reproductive, and whose outcome is measured in land and in births. The 4-year war at Gombe was this process, compressed into 4 years, documented by researchers who had the access and the methods to record what was happening. The process continues wherever chimpanzees live, in communities large enough to conduct it. Sleep well. It is 3 in the morning in Kibale National Park, Uganda. The forest is dark. The research team has been following this group of males since the previous afternoon, and now the males are moving. They are not moving the way chimpanzees move when they are foraging. There is no feeding, no branch shaking, no casual stopping to investigate a fruit tree or a termite mound. They are moving in single file, in the same direction, in silence. And they have been doing this for 40 minutes. The researcher walking behind them is not using a flashlight. The beam would break the darkness that the males are using as cover. She is following the sound of their feet on the forest floor and the occasional faint outline of a dark form against the slightly lighter dark of the forest canopy. The males are on patrol. Subscribe right now and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Hit that button. It costs you nothing, and it keeps this channel going. Drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. We read every single one. What you are about to read is an account of what a chimpanzee raid looks like from the inside, reconstructed from the field notes, and published accounts of the researchers who have been present during intergroup encounters at the long-term research sites in Uganda and Tanzania and Ivory Coast. No single account covers everything in this video. The behavioral ecology that this video describes is assembled from the observations of dozens of researchers across decades of fieldwork, and what it produces is the closest available account of what it would mean to witness a chimpanzee raid, from the position of the observer who is moving through the forest, with the males who are conducting it. The males who are patrolling tonight are 8 in number. The alpha male is at the front of the file. He has been in this position for the last 20 minutes, moving steadily in the direction of the southern boundary of the community's territory. Behind him, in an order that is not random, the other 7 males follow. The social hierarchy of the community is reflected in the patrol formation in ways that the research has documented. The highest-ranking males are at the front, closest to the direction of potential contact, and the lower-ranking males are further back. Whether this formation reflects a conscious allocation of risk, or simply the tendency of dominant animals to lead in social situations, is one of the questions that the behavioral research has not resolved. The silence is the first thing that a first-time observer notices, because it is so different from the normal acoustic texture of a chimpanzee group moving through the forest. Chimpanzees in a foraging context are not quiet. They vocalize to maintain contact across the forest. They display on branches and buttresses. They call out when they find food. None of this is happening now. The 8 males are moving through the forest as a nearly silent unit, and the silence is maintained with a consistency that suggests it is being actively managed rather than simply reflecting a lull in social activity. The second thing a first-time observer notices is the head movement. The males are not looking at the ground or at the vegetation around them in the scanning pattern of an animal looking for food. They are looking outward, in the direction of travel and to the sides, in the pattern of an animal monitoring the environment for a threat or a target, rather than a resource. The ears are moving too, rotating in the independent way that primate ears can move, tracking sounds from multiple directions simultaneously. The males are reading the acoustic environment of the forest boundary zone for the sounds that would indicate the presence of a neighboring community male, and they are doing this with the focused attention of animals that know what they are looking for. The patrol reaches the boundary zone, which is not marked by any physical feature that a human observer would identify as a boundary, but which the chimpanzees clearly recognize as such. Their behavior changes at the boundary, in ways that are consistent across many observations. They slow down, they increase the frequency of sniffing at the ground and at vegetation, they look for the visual and olfactory signs of recent activity by neighboring community males. Fresh dung, disturbed vegetation, the scent marks that males deposit on tree trunks. The boundary zone is a landscape of signs that the males are reading, and the reading is producing information that is influencing the behavior of the group in ways that the researcher can observe but not fully decode. The alpha male stops. The males behind him stop. He is sniffing a tree trunk at the boundary zone, and what he is reading in the chemical information on the bark is information about who has been here recently and when. The scent marks that chimpanzees leave on tree trunks are not simply territorial markers. They contain information about the identity of the marking individual, the time since the mark was deposited, and the reproductive state of the marker at the time of deposition. The alpha male is reading this information with a sensory system whose chemical detection capability is substantially more sensitive than the human olfactory system. And the behavioral decision that follows the reading is made on the basis of information that the researcher standing beside him cannot access. The alpha male does something with his posture that the experienced researcher recognizes as a signal. He does not vocalize, he does not gesture. He changes the angle of his head, and the males behind him respond to this change in a way that suggests it carries social information. The group begins to move again, but now the direction has shifted slightly and the pace has slowed further. The alpha has detected something in the boundary zone that has changed the group's behavior, and what he has detected is, in the researcher's interpretation based on many similar observations, the fresh signs of a small number of neighboring community males in an area that is close enough to warrant investigation. The next 40 minutes are the most behaviorally intense period of the patrol. The males are moving slowly and deliberately through an area of dense vegetation at the boundary, stopping frequently to sniff and to listen, moving in a configuration that the researcher recognizes as search behavior rather than travel behavior. The spacing between the males has contracted from the single file of the earlier travel to a tighter grouping that keeps the individuals in visual contact with each other without producing the auditory noise of close contact social behavior. The males are maintaining social cohesion while minimizing their acoustic signature, and the behavioral coordination that this requires is being achieved without vocalization, through postural signals and visual monitoring that keep the group's movements synchronized. Then one of the males, not the alpha but a large male ranked second or third in the hierarchy, stops completely and stares into the vegetation to the east. He does not vocalize, he does not display. He stands absolutely still and stares. The other males stop and follow the direction of his gaze. And now the researcher, who has been watching the males rather than the vegetation they are staring at, looks in the same direction. She sees nothing. The forest is dark and dense, and what is in the direction the males are staring is indistinguishable from what is in every other direction. But the males are seeing or hearing something that she cannot detect, and the quality of their attention has changed in a way that the researcher has learned to read as the behavioral signature of contact with a neighboring community member. What happens next depends on factors that the researcher cannot directly assess. How many neighboring males are in the vegetation to the east? How close are they? Are they aware of the patrolling group, or are they still undetected? The assessment of numerical advantage that the research has identified as the strongest predictor of whether a patrol escalates to a lethal attack is happening right now. In the cognitive processing of the 8 males who are standing in the dark forest and reading the available evidence about the situation, on the other side of the vegetation boundary. If the 8 males assess that the neighboring group is smaller than themselves, or that a lone male is within reach, the behavior that follows has been described in the field notes of researchers who have witnessed it, and the description is one of the most striking accounts in the literature of animal behavior. The group moves as a unit toward the detected neighboring individual. The movement is fast and coordinated, with the alpha and the highest-ranking males in the front. There is no vocalization. The attack, when it begins with physical contact rather than with a display, and the physical contact is sustained and directed in a way that the research literature describes as qualitatively different from within community aggression. The victim is held down. The biting is directed at the face, the throat, and the hands. The attack is maintained for a period of minutes. The neighboring male, if he is alone, cannot escape. If the 8 males assess that the neighboring group is too large to attack, the behavior that follows is different. The group may produce a chorus of calls, a coordinated vocal display that communicates their presence and their numbers to the neighboring group without initiating physical contact, and then withdraw. Or they may withdraw silently the way they came. The decision to advance or to withdraw is made on the basis of the numerical assessment, and the behavioral outcome of the patrol, whether it becomes an attack or a display or a withdrawal, is determined by that assessment. The researcher following the patrol does not always know which outcome is coming. The period between the detection of the neighboring males and the behavioral response of the patrolling group is a period of uncertainty that the field notes describe with a quality of tension that comes from witnessing a situation whose outcome is genuinely unknown and whose stakes are, for the animals involved, genuinely high. The researcher is not in danger. The attack, if it comes, will be directed at the neighboring community males, not at the human observer whose presence the patrolling males have tolerated for years. But the observer is present at a moment when the behavioral system that drives chimpanzee territorial competition is operating at its most acute. And the observation of that moment is one of the experiences that the researchers who have had it describe as among the most affecting of their fieldwork careers. The research record of chimpanzee raids includes accounts of the sounds that accompany the attacks when they occur. The screams of the victim, the calls of the patrolling males that break the silence of the patrol once contact has been made, the crashing of vegetation as the attack unfolds. The accounts from researchers who have been present during lethal attacks describe the transition from the silence of the patrol to the noise of the attack as one of the most dramatic changes in the acoustic environment that the forest produces, and they describe the aftermath of the attack, the silence that returns after the patrolling males have withdrawn and the victim has stopped responding, with the same quality of disturbance that the behavioral description of what happened does not fully capture. The patrol that this video has been following returns to the core of the community's range before dawn. The males move faster on the return journey, their behavioral signature shifting back toward the ordinary foraging movement pattern as they leave the boundary zone behind. By the time the sun rises, they are in the fruit trees of the community's core range, feeding, vocalizing, resuming the social interactions of ordinary community life. The patrol is over. Whether it produced a contact and what the contact produced is information that the researchers' field notes will record and that the research program's dataset will incorporate into the long-term record of the community's intergroup competitive behavior. What the researcher carries back to the research station with her is not just field notes. It is the experience of having moved through a dark forest at 3 in the morning behind 8 chimpanzees who were conducting a behavior that the science has spent 50 years trying to understand, and who conducted it with a coordination and a purposefulness that the experience of witnessing it makes more difficult to reduce to simple explanations than the behavioral descriptions in the research literature sometimes suggest. The chimpanzees on patrol are not simply acting out a behavioral program that their genes have specified. They are assessing a situation, communicating about the assessment, making a decision, and acting on the decision in a coordinated way that requires social cognition of a kind that the simple predator-prey framing of the hunt does not adequately capture. What witnessing a chimpanzee raid would feel like is what this video has tried to convey. The silence, the darkness, the tension of the assessment, and the knowledge carried by the researcher but not by the males she is following. of what the behavioral system she is observing has produced in the research record of the communities she has been studying for years. Sleep well. The recruitment behavior that precedes a patrol, which is the process by which the males who will participate in the patrol are assembled, has been studied in enough detail to reveal that it is not random and not simply a matter of who happens to be present when the alpha male begins moving in the direction of the boundary. The behavioral cues that signal the transition from ordinary community activity to patrol mode are produced by the alpha male and responded to selectively by the other males of the community. Some males respond to these cues consistently and join the patrol reliably. Others respond inconsistently, joining some patrols and remaining in the core range during others. And some males, particularly the lowest-ranking males and the adolescent males who are not yet full participants in the community's competitive behavior, rarely join patrols at all. The composition of any given patrol reflects the social dynamics of the community as much as it reflects the strategic logic of the patrol itself. The communication that the patrolling males use to coordinate their behavior during the patrol is one of the behavioral dimensions of the raid that the research has found most difficult to document, because the communication that is occurring is happening through channels that are not easily observed. The postural signals that the alpha male uses to communicate changes in direction or pace to the males behind him are signals that the experienced researcher has learned to read, but that are subtle enough that many of the behavioral cues involved have not been formally documented in the research literature. The possibility that the males are also communicating through quiet vocalizations below the threshold of easy human detection, or through tactile signals when they are in close proximity, is one that the research has not excluded. What is clear is that the coordination of the group's behavior during the patrol is achieved through some communicative mechanism, and that the mechanism is quiet enough not to compromise the acoustic concealment that the patrol's effectiveness requires. The terrain that the patrol moves through is terrain that the patrolling males know in the detailed experiential way that animals know the landscape they have spent their lives in. The patrol route is not arbitrary. The males use the paths and the terrain features of the boundary zone in ways that reflect the accumulated knowledge of individuals who have patrolled this boundary many times before, and who know the locations of the signs of neighboring community activity, the travel routes that neighboring community males use, and the areas of the boundary zone where the cover is dense enough to allow the approach to close range without detection. The cognitive map that the patrolling males are using is a map built from years of patrolling experience, and the males who have patrolled most frequently are the males whose knowledge of the boundary zone is most detailed and whose behavioral contribution to the patrol's effectiveness is most significant. The sensory capabilities that the patrolling males deploy in the boundary zone are capabilities that the science of chimpanzee sensory biology is still working to characterize fully, but that the behavioral evidence of the patrol suggests are substantially greater than the human sensory capabilities that the researcher is relying on in the same environment. The chimpanzee's olfactory sensitivity, which is estimated to be substantially greater than the humans for most biologically relevant chemical compounds, allows the males to detect the scent marks of neighboring community males at concentrations and from distances that the human observer cannot match. The chimpanzee's hearing, which covers a frequency range similar to the humans but with different sensitivity profiles across that range, allows the males to detect the vocalizations and the movement sounds of neighboring community males through dense vegetation that provides acoustic as well as visual concealment. And the chimpanzee's vision in low-light conditions, which is better than the humans partly because of the larger pupil diameter that allows more light to reach the retina, gives the males in the dark forest a visual advantage over the human researcher who is following them without a flashlight. The aftermath of a successful raid, in the hours and days following a lethal attack on a neighboring community male, shows behavioral changes in the raiding community that the research has documented as indicators of elevated arousal and social bonding. The males who participated in the attack show increased affiliative behavior toward each other in the hours following their return to the community's core range, including elevated grooming rates between the pairs and groups that were most actively involved in the attack. The within-community social cohesion that the research has proposed as one of the functions of intergroup aggression, is most visible in the immediate post-attack period, when the shared experience of the attack and the return from the boundary zone appears to strengthen the social bonds between the males who participated together. The neighboring community, whose male was attacked, is affected by the raid in ways that extend beyond the immediate injury or death of the victim. The acoustic evidence of the attack, the calls that broke the patrol's silence when contact was made, carries through the forest to the members of the neighboring community who are in the area, and their behavioral responses to this acoustic evidence have been documented by researchers who were in the neighboring community's range during the attack. The behavioral changes that the neighboring community shows in the days following a lethal attack by the raiding community include reduced ranging into the boundary zone that the attack occurred in, increased vigilance in the males who are now patrolling their own boundaries in response to the demonstrated threat from the raiding community, and in some cases, a shift in the core ranging area of the community away from the boundary that has been the site of the attack. The raid changes the competitive landscape of the forest for both communities, and the behavioral adjustments that the neighboring community makes in response to the raid are part of the dynamic intergroup competition that the raid was a part of. The research on the cognitive and emotional state of the chimpanzees during the patrol, which is one of the dimensions of the behavior that the science is least equipped to assess with the tools currently available, is approached indirectly through the behavioral indicators of arousal and motivation that the observable behaviors provide. The cortisol levels in the urine of chimpanzees before, during, and after patrol activities, which have been measured in communities where non-invasive urine sampling is possible during patrol periods, show elevated levels during patrol activities compared to ordinary foraging activities, a pattern consistent with the elevated physiological arousal that the behavioral description of the patrol suggests. The behavioral indicators of arousal during patrols, including piloerection, increased heart rate visible in the peripheral veins of the face and neck, and the postural changes associated with vigilance and threat assessment, are all consistently elevated in the males during patrol activities compared to their baseline during ordinary foraging. What the chimpanzees are experiencing during the patrol is, in the functional terms that the behavioral and physiological evidence supports, something that the language of tension and alertness is not inappropriate to describe. The researchers who have spent the most time following chimpanzee patrols describe the experience of the patrol with a consistency that reflects the genuine quality of the behavioral situation they are witnessing. The three in the morning darkness, the silence of the males moving through the forest, the shift in the group's behavior when the signs of neighboring community activity are detected, the assessment period, during which the outcome of the patrol is being determined by a cognitive process that the researcher can observe the inputs and the outputs of but cannot directly access, and the return to the core range with the behavioral changes that signal the end of the patrol state and the resumption of ordinary community life. The experience of witnessing a chimpanzee patrol is an experience that the researchers who have had it returned to in their accounts of fieldwork because it captures something about the behavioral complexity of the animal that the descriptions of individual behaviors do not convey in the same way. The patrol is the behavioral system in action, as a whole, doing what the system was built to do. The field research methodology that makes the observation of chimpanzee patrols possible is a methodology that has been developed over decades of trial and error in the long-term research programs at Gombe, Kibale, Tai, and the other sites where chimpanzee behavior has been studied. The habituation process, which involves years of non-threatening human presence in the chimpanzee community's range until the animals become comfortable with human observers at close range, is the foundational methodological achievement that makes all of the behavioral observation possible. Without habituation, the chimpanzees would flee from human observers before the behavioral data could be collected. With habituation, the humans can move with the chimpanzees through the forest at distances close enough to observe the behavioral details that the research requires. The habituation process takes 3 to 5 years for a new community, and the investment of time and resources that it requires is one of the reasons why the long-term research programs are so valuable. The habituated communities that they have built represent years of methodological investment that cannot be quickly replicated elsewhere. The comparison between the chimpanzee patrol and the military patrol in human warfare, which the researchers who study chimpanzee intergroup violence have been reluctant to make explicitly because of the conceptual baggage that the military framing carries, is nevertheless a comparison that the behavioral descriptions of both phenomena invite. The silence, the formation movement, the assessment of numerical advantage before engagement, the coordination of attack behavior, and the retreat to safe territory after the engagement are all features of the chimpanzee patrol that have direct parallels in the descriptions of military patrol behavior in small-scale human conflicts. Whether these parallels reflect a genuine evolutionary homology between the two behavioral systems, as the researchers who argue for the deep evolutionary origins of human warfare maintain, or whether they reflect the convergent evolution of similar solutions to similar competitive problems in two very different species, is a question that the behavioral evidence alone cannot answer. But the parallels are real, and the question they raise is one of the most important questions that the study of chimpanzee behavior has generated. The account of a chimpanzee raid that this video has been building is an account constructed from the published observations of researchers who have been present during patrol and raid events at the long-term research sites in East and West Africa. It is not a single event, it is a composite, built from the most detailed and the most consistent elements of the available accounts, whose purpose is to convey the behavioral reality of the chimpanzee raid in a way that the summary descriptions in the scientific literature do not. The details that seem most dramatic, the silence of the patrol, the coordinated response to the detection of neighboring males, the sustained and directed nature of the attack, are the details that are most consistently reported across the different accounts from different research sites and different researchers. The consistency of these details across the geographic and ecological diversity of the research sites where the behavior has been documented is one of the strongest arguments for the reality and the generality of the behavioral system that the accounts describe. The forest that the patrol moved through tonight will look the same tomorrow morning as it looked before the patrol. The vegetation will not record what happened. The sounds will not persist. The only record of the patrol is in the field notes of the researcher who followed it and in the physiological data from the non-invasive samples that the research program will collect in the days following the patrol. Whether the patrol produced a contact and whether the contact produced an attack will be known only to the researcher, whose notes contain the account of what happened after the behavioral dynamics described in this video reached their conclusion. What happened is part of the long-term data set that the research programs are building, event by event, patrol by patrol, across the years of continuous monitoring that produce the behavioral picture of chimpanzee intergroup competition that the science is still working to complete. The forest is quiet now. The males are in their nests, and the boundary zone, where the assessment was made tonight, is there in the darkness, unmarked and unchanged, waiting for the next patrol. Sleep well. The individual males who are most frequently at the front of the patrol, closest to the direction of potential contact with the neighboring community, are the males whose behavioral contribution to the patrol is most visible and most consequential. The alpha male's decision to advance or to withdraw, made on the basis of the assessment of the neighboring community's size and proximity, is the decision that determines whether the patrol becomes an attack. The second-ranking male's contribution to the assessment, which may include information gathered from a position slightly different from the alpha's, influences the alpha's decision in ways that the research has not yet been able to characterize precisely. The behavioral coordination between the highest-ranking males during the assessment period is the behavioral mechanism through which the community's collective decision about whether to attack is made, and it is a mechanism that the research has documented at the level of its behavioral outputs, without yet characterizing the cognitive process that produces those outputs. The experience of the researcher who follows a patrol that produces a lethal attack is an experience that the published accounts describe with a consistent quality of disturbance that the clinical language of the research literature only partially conveys. The transition from the silence of the patrol to the noise of the attack, the sounds of the attack itself, and the silence that follows when the attacking males have withdrawn and the victim has stopped responding, are described by researchers who have been present with an immediacy that reflects the genuine impact of witnessing the event at close range. The published accounts include statements about the difficulty of processing what has been observed within the framework of animal behavior research that is premised on non-interference, and about the lasting quality of the memory of having been present during an event that the behavioral description in the field notes accurately records but does not fully capture. The science that the observations produce is real and valuable. The experience of producing it is one that the accounts suggest is not easily forgotten. The night moves on in the Kibale forest. The patrol that this video has been following has returned to the community's core range, and the males are in their nests before sunrise. What happened in the boundary zone in the hours before dawn is known to the researcher whose notes contain the account, and to the chimpanzees who were part of the patrol. The forest does not keep records in the way the research program does. The behavioral event of the patrol, and whatever contact it did or did not produce, is already receding into the past that the forest absorbs without leaving traces that a human observer could find and read. What persists is the relationship between the communities that the patrol was a part of, the competitive dynamic that the patrol expressed, and the territorial landscape, whose current state is the accumulated outcome of all the patrols and all the contacts and all the assessments that have been made in this forest over the years and decades of chimpanzee social life that preceded the research program's arrival and that will continue after it. The patrol was one event in a continuous process. The process continues. Sleep well. The chimpanzees who have been followed by the Kibale research program for decades are individuals whose behavioral histories span more patrol events than any single researcher has witnessed. The alpha male who is leading tonight's patrol has been on patrol since he was a young adult, and the behavioral knowledge he brings to the assessment of the boundary zone is the knowledge of an animal who has made this assessment many times before, in many different conditions, with many different outcomes. The decisions he makes tonight are informed by an experiential history that the research record partially captures and that the animal himself carries in a form that behavioral science is still developing the tools to characterize. What he knows about the boundary zone, about the neighboring community, and about the conditions under which an attack is likely to succeed is knowledge that has been built across years of patrolling, and it is the kind of knowledge that the research programs are working to understand by following the animals who possess it through the behavioral events that knowledge produces. Sleep well. The question of what the chimpanzees are thinking during the patrol, which is the question that the immersive framing of this video has been circling, is a question that the behavioral science of animal cognition is not yet equipped to answer directly. The behavioral evidence, which shows coordination, assessment, and adaptive decision-making, is consistent with a genuine cognitive representation of the goal of the patrol and the means of achieving it. It is also consistent with a more mechanistic account in which the behavioral outputs are produced by simpler cognitive processes that do not require the attribution of goals and plans in the rich sense that human cognition involves. The difficulty of distinguishing between these two accounts on the basis of behavioral evidence alone is one of the central methodological challenges of animal cognition research, and the chimpanzee patrol is one of the behavioral phenomena where the distinction matters most for the question of what chimpanzee cognition is. The researchers, who have devoted their careers to following chimpanzees through the dark forest at 3 in the morning, describe the work with a consistent quality of engagement that reflects the genuine interest of the behavioral phenomenon they are studying. The patrol is not routine. Every patrol is a potential event whose outcome is unknown until it has concluded, and the knowledge that the outcome of any given patrol could be one of the lethal attacks that the research record has documented makes the experience of following the patrol one of the most behaviorally interesting and personally affecting experiences that fieldwork in animal behavior produces. The researchers who describe following patrols describe them as events that make the theoretical questions of chimpanzee behavioral ecology concrete in a way that the analysis of behavioral data in the office does not. And the impact of having witnessed the behavior that the theory is trying to explain is visible in the quality of the accounts they produce of what they have seen. Sleep well. The account of the chimpanzee raid that this video has assembled from the research literature is an account of something that is happening right now in the forests of East and West Africa, where the research programs are monitoring chimpanzee communities, and in the much larger area of the chimpanzees range where no research programs are present and where the behavior is occurring without any human observer to document it. The full scope of chimpanzee intergroup violence across the species range is unknown, and the research record is a sample of unknown representativeness from a behavioral phenomenon whose total extent is substantially larger than the data that the research programs have produced. What the research has established is that the behavior is real, consistent, and produced by a behavioral system whose logic and whose consequences are now well enough understood to make the question of what it means for understanding chimpanzee social life and for understanding the evolutionary origins of human social behavior one of the most productive and most important questions in primatology. Sleep well. The patrol that began this video at 3 in the morning in Kibale National Park ends, as all patrols end, in one of 3 outcomes: a lethal attack on a neighboring community male, a vocal display that communicates the patrolling group's presence and numbers without physical contact, or a silent withdrawal from the boundary zone when the assessment of the neighboring group's size makes advancement too costly. Each outcome is part of the behavioral data that the research programs are collecting, and each outcome contributes to the long-term picture of intergroup competition that the data is building. The patrol itself, regardless of its outcome, is the behavioral system doing what it was built to do, gathering information about the competitive landscape of the community's territory, assessing the current state of the intergroup competition, and making the behavioral decisions that the assessment produces. The patrol is chimpanzee territorial competition in its most active and most consequential form, and witnessing it, as the researcher at the front of this video has witnessed it, is witnessing one of the most behaviorally complex and most evolutionarily significant events in the behavioral repertoire of the species most closely related to our own. Sleep well. The sun will rise over Kibale in a few hours, and the males who conducted the patrol will be in the fruit trees, feeding, vocalizing, engaging in the grooming and the social display that ordinary community life consists of. The patrol will be over. The forest will look the same. And somewhere in the research station, the researcher who followed the patrol will be writing the field notes that record what happened in the boundary zone in the hours before dawn. Notes that will become part of a data set that is still being assembled 50 years after the first patrol was documented in the forests where chimpanzees are still doing what they have always done. The patrol is over. The process continues. Sleep well. The darkness of the forest at 3 in the morning is not the same darkness for the chimpanzees moving through it as it is for the researcher following them. The chimpanzee's visual system, whose low-light performance substantially exceeds the humans, gives the males a sensory environment that is functionally richer than the environment the researcher experiences in the same time and place. The chemical information in the air, detectable to the chimpanzee's olfactory system, at concentrations that the human sensory system cannot register, adds a layer to the chimpanzee's representation of the environment that the researcher lacks entirely. And the vibrational and acoustic information that the chimpanzee's hearing and tactile systems provide about the movements and the sounds of the neighboring community males in the boundary zone is information that the researcher is receiving at a fraction of the resolution and sensitivity that the chimpanzees are processing. The researcher is following animals that are navigating a sensory world substantially richer than the sensory world the researcher occupies, and the behavioral decisions that the patrol produces are made on the basis of that richer sensory input rather than on the basis of what the researcher can observe. Witnessing a chimpanzee patrol is witnessing decision-making at the boundary of what a human observer can directly perceive. And the limits of the researcher's perception are part of the story of what the patrol is. The territory that the patrolling males are defending tonight is territory that their community has held across multiple generations of social membership. Territory whose boundaries have been established through years of patrols and contacts and the outcomes that those contacts produced. the current state of the boundary, its location, the areas of contested overlap with the neighboring community's range, the terrain features that the males use as reference points in the boundary zone, is a state that reflects the accumulated history of the competitive interactions between the two communities over years. The territory is not simply a geographic area. It is a social landscape maintained by the behavioral efforts of the community's males and shaped by the competitive history of the intergroup relationship. The patrol that this video has been following is one event in the continuous process of maintaining and potentially expanding that social landscape. The forest holds the history of the process in the distribution of the communities that currently inhabit it, and the patrol adds another data point to that history tonight. Sleep well. The chimpanzee raid is not a metaphor for human warfare. It is an event in the behavioral repertoire of a non-human species that shares approximately 98.7% of its genome with the human species, and that shares in the behavioral description of its intergroup violence enough features with the behavioral description of human intergroup violence that the comparison is unavoidable. And the question of what the comparison means is one of the most important questions that the behavioral sciences are currently engaged with. The patrol, the coalition, the assessment of numerical advantage, the lethal attack on lone or small group members of the neighboring community, the territorial expansion that successful attacks produce. These are not metaphors, they are behaviors documented in multiple populations of chimpanzees across the geographic range of the species, and they are behaviors that a researcher can follow through a dark forest at 3 in the morning with a notebook and a headlamp that she keeps off because the males she is following need the darkness. Sleep well. The forest at Kibale is quiet now. The patrol is over. The males are in their nests. And in the research station, the field notes from tonight's patrol are being written by the researcher who followed it, adding one more account to a research record that has been building since Jane Goodall first sat in the Gombe forest more than 60 years ago, and began watching the same behavior in a different forest on the other side of the continent. The record continues to build, patrol by patrol, contact by contact, lethal attack by lethal attack, and the understanding of what the behavior is and what it means continues to develop alongside the record. What you would witness if you were there, if you were following those 8 males through the darkness at 3 in the morning, is what this video has tried to convey. The silence, the assessment, the decision, and whatever comes after it, written into the field notes of a researcher who is still in the forest, still following the males, still watching. Sleep well. The 8 males who conducted tonight's patrol will wake before dawn and begin foraging in the fruit trees of the community's core range. The social dynamics of the community will resume as if the patrol had not happened, because for the community members who were not on the patrol, it did not happen in any immediately visible way. The community's life continues, the foraging and the grooming and the dominance competitions and the play of the juveniles, and the patrol is one thread in the fabric of that life, invisible to most of the community's members and visible only in its consequences, when those consequences eventually change the competitive landscape that shapes the community's behavior. The forest holds all of this simultaneously, the ordinary life of the community in its core range and the competitive engagement at the boundaries that is changing the conditions of that ordinary life in ways that will only become fully visible over months and years. The patrol is part of what makes the ordinary life possible. The ordinary life is what the patrol is for. Sleep well. In 2014, a paper was published in the journal Nature that should have ended a debate that had been running for 40 years. It did not end the debate. It intensified it. The paper, authored by Michael Wilson, Richard Wrangham, and 28 other researchers, pooled behavioral data from 18 chimpanzee study sites and 5 bonobo sites across Africa. It asked a simple question. Does chimpanzee intergroup killing happen because chimpanzees are naturally violent, or because the presence of human researchers and the provisioning of food at research sites has made them more aggressive than they would otherwise be? The answer the data produced was clear. The killing happened at similar rates in provisioned and unprovisioned sites. It correlated with community size and population density, not with the degree of human disturbance. The conclusion was that chimpanzee intergroup killing is an adaptive behavior, not an artifact of the research conditions. The debate did not end. Subscribe right now and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Hit that button. It costs you nothing and keeps this channel going. Drop a comment right now telling us where you are in the world and what time it is there. Every single one gets read. The question of why chimpanzees kill each other is not a simple question, despite the decades of research that have been directed at it. It is a question that sits at the intersection of behavioral ecology, evolutionary biology, cognitive science, and the deepest questions about the relationship between human nature and the nature of our closest living relatives. And the debate around it has been conducted with an intensity that reflects the stakes. If chimpanzee intergroup killing is adaptive, ancient, and shared with the human lineage, then human warfare has evolutionary roots that go back millions of years. If it is not, then human warfare is something we built ourselves through culture and circumstance, and its absence from our nature is at least conceivable. Those are not equivalent conclusions, and the people arguing about them know it. The debate began in its modern form with the discovery of the 4-year war at Gombe that this channel's previous video described. Before that discovery, the assumption was that lethal violence between chimpanzee communities was either absent or vanishingly rare. After it, the assumption was that the violence was real. The debate shifted to why. Richard Wrangham proposed the imbalanced power hypothesis, which is the theoretical framework that has organized the adaptive interpretation of chimpanzee intergroup killing since the 1990s. The hypothesis is straightforward. Chimpanzees kill members of neighboring communities when the numerical advantage is sufficient to make the attack low cost for the attackers, and when the killing produces a territorial benefit that translates into reproductive success. The killing is adaptive because it pays off in the currency of natural selection. Communities that kill more have more territory. Communities with more territory have more food. Communities with more food reproduce more successfully. The males who kill most effectively are the males whose descendants inherit the behavioral tendency to kill effectively. Over generations, the tendency is maintained in the population because it is adaptive. The opposing framework, developed most systematically by Brian Ferguson and Robert Walker, among others, argues that the killing is not adaptive in the evolutionary sense, but is instead a response to the environmental disruption produced by human contact with wild chimpanzee populations. The provisioning of food at research sites, the presence of human observers who alter the movement patterns and the ranging behavior of the communities they monitor, and the habitat compression that reduces the territory available to chimpanzee communities in the landscapes surrounding research areas, are all factors that the disruption hypothesis proposes as the cause of elevated violence rates. The prediction is that undisturbed chimpanzee communities in intact habitats show lower rates of intergroup killing than the disturbed communities at research sites. The 2014 paper was designed to test this prediction directly, and the data it analyzed was the most comprehensive data set on chimpanzee intergroup killing that had ever been assembled. The result, as described at the beginning of this video, did not support the disruption hypothesis. But the critics of the 2014 analysis argued that the dataset was not as clean a test of the hypothesis as the authors claimed, because all of the sites in the dataset had some degree of human contact, and the question of what an undisturbed chimpanzee population would look like had not been answered by any of them. The bonobo comparison is the empirical fact that neither side of the debate can ignore, and that both sides have had to find a way to incorporate into their frameworks. Bonobos, who share approximately 99.6% of their genome with chimpanzees, and who live in social communities organized by a broadly similar principle of male philopatry and female transfer, do not show lethal intergroup killing. The intergroup encounters that have been documented at bonobo research sites in the Democratic Republic of Congo show affiliative behavior between members of different communities, including the grooming and the socio-sexual interactions that bonobos use to reduce tension in all social contexts, rather than the hostility and the lethal violence that characterize chimpanzee intergroup encounters. For the adaptive hypothesis, the bonobo's absence of killing is explained by the ecological conditions of the bonobo's habitat. The Congo Basin forest, where bonobos live, has food resources distributed in a way that reduces the value of territorial defense relative to the value of expanding affiliative networks. The bonobo's food environment rewards cooperation across community boundaries rather than competition for exclusive territorial access. And the behavioral difference between bonobos and chimpanzees reflects the different adaptive landscapes that the two species inhabit. The chimpanzee kills because killing pays. The bonobo does not kill because killing does not pay in the bonobo's ecological context. For the disruption hypothesis, the bonobo comparison is more complex. Bonobo research sites are also subject to human contact and provisioning, though the degree of disruption varies between sites. The absence of killing in bonobos, despite this disruption, is consistent with the adaptive hypothesis's ecological explanation, but it is also consistent with the disruption hypothesis if the disruption hypothesis is interpreted as a claim about the interaction between human disturbance and an underlying tendency toward violence that varies between species. The bonobo comparison does not definitively distinguish between the two frameworks. The cognitive dimension of the debate, which asks what the chimpanzees who kill are actually doing in the cognitive sense when they plan and execute a lethal attack, is one that the behavioral evidence can approach but not fully resolve. The behavioral signatures of planning that the patrol displays, the delayed response to the opportunity for an attack when numerical advantage is insufficient, the selection of lone or small group targets rather than engaging larger groups, and the sustained and directed nature of the attack behavior are all consistent with a genuine cognitive representation of a goal and the means of achieving it. But the same behaviors are also consistent with a more mechanistic account, in which the behavioral program is activated by the sensory input of a detected neighboring community male in a context of numerical advantage, without requiring the attribution of deliberate planning in the human sense. The question of whether chimpanzees plan their attacks in the cognitive sense that humans plan military operations is a question that the available evidence does not resolve, and it is a question that matters for the comparative interpretation of the behavior. If the chimpanzees are planning in a cognitively rich sense, then the comparison with human warfare is a comparison of genuinely similar cognitive processes operating in similar social contexts, and the evolutionary continuity between the two phenomena is a substantive claim about the shared cognitive architecture of chimpanzees and humans. If the chimpanzees are not planning in this sense, then the behavioral similarity between chimpanzee raids and human military operations is a convergence of behavioral outcomes produced by different cognitive mechanisms, and the evolutionary continuity claim is weaker. The research on chimpanzee cognition that this channel has covered in the series on chimpanzee intelligence is relevant here, because it establishes that chimpanzees are capable of a level of cognitive sophistication that the simpler mechanistic accounts of their behavior may underestimate. The chimpanzee that passes the mirror self-recognition test, that demonstrates future planning in food caching tasks, and that shows theory of mind in competitive contexts, is a chimpanzee whose cognitive architecture supports a level of planning and social cognition that makes the attribution of genuine goal-directed behavior in the intergroup killing context more, not less, plausible. The cognitive research and the behavioral research on intergroup violence are not separate stories. They are parts of the same story about what chimpanzee minds are capable of. The cultural transmission dimension of the debate asks whether the intergroup killing is learned behavior that is transmitted across generations within communities, or whether it is an expression of an evolved behavioral tendency that does not require social learning for its expression. The evidence from the comparison of communities at different research sites, which shows variation in patrol frequency and attack rate between communities in the same region, is consistent with the cultural transmission hypothesis. Communities whose males have established a high patrol frequency through the reinforcement of successful territorial expansion are communities that transmit this behavioral pattern to the next generation through social learning. But the consistency of the basic behavioral pattern across geographically and ecologically diverse sites is also consistent with the evolved tendency hypothesis. The basic tendency to patrol and to attack under favorable conditions is present across the species, and the variation between communities reflects the degree to which local conditions favor the expression of this tendency rather than variation in whether the tendency is present. The research on individual variation in participation in intergroup aggression within communities illuminates the question of cultural transmission by revealing that the tendency to participate in patrols and attacks is not uniformly distributed across the adult males of a community. The highest-ranking males participate most actively, the lowest-ranking males participate least, and the individual variation in participation is stable across time, in ways that reflect the individual's social position and social relationships within the community, rather than simple individual differences in aggressive tendency. The social determinants of who participates in the violence are part of what makes the behavior a social phenomenon, rather than simply an expression of individual aggression, and they are part of what makes the cultural transmission hypothesis plausible. What is transmitted across generations is not just a tendency to be aggressive, but a social context in which aggression is organized and directed in ways that produce the outcomes the adaptive hypothesis predicts. The human evolutionary implications of the debate, which are the stakes that give the scientific disagreement its intensity, depend on whether the chimpanzee intergroup killing is best understood as homologous to human warfare or as analogous to it. A homology is a similarity that reflects shared evolutionary origin, a behavior that both species inherited from a common ancestor who showed the same behavior. An analogy is a similarity that reflects convergent evolution, two species independently developing similar behaviors because they face similar adaptive challenges. The argument that chimpanzee and human intergroup violence are homologous is an argument that the common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans, who lived approximately 6 million years ago, was already showing the coalition-based lethal intergroup violence that both species show today. The argument that they are analogous is an argument that chimpanzees and humans independently evolved similar behaviors in response to similar ecological and social pressures, without those behaviors necessarily reflecting a shared ancestral tendency. The distinction between homology and analogy cannot be resolved by behavioral evidence from living species alone. The fossil and archaeological record of the human lineage is relevant, and the evidence from that record is contested but suggestive. The oldest clear archaeological evidence of organized intergroup violence in the human lineage dates to approximately 10,000 years ago in sites like Nataruk in Kenya, where the skeletal remains of 12 individuals show wounds consistent with lethal intergroup violence. But the evidence from much earlier periods is ambiguous enough that the question of when in human evolution organized intergroup killing appeared cannot be answered from the current data with the precision that would definitively support or exclude the homology hypothesis. The debate continues. The 2014 paper was not the last word, and the responses to it have produced a body of literature that is still being actively argued. The researchers on both sides of the debate are working with the same behavioral data and reaching different conclusions because they are applying different theoretical frameworks to that data, and because the data, despite its comprehensiveness, does not uniquely determine which framework is correct. This is what a genuine scientific debate looks like, not a disagreement about the facts, but a disagreement about what the facts mean, conducted by researchers who know the facts as well as anyone, and who disagree about their interpretation, because the interpretation depends on theoretical commitments that the facts alone cannot resolve. What the chimpanzees in the forest are doing is not influenced by the debate about what they are doing. They are patrolling their boundaries and attacking their neighbors and expanding their territories in the forests of East and West Africa, as they have been doing for far longer than the research programs that have been documenting their behavior have existed, and for far longer than the debate about the evolutionary significance of that behavior has been running. The science is working to understand what the behavior is and why it exists. The behavior exists independently of the understanding. The chimpanzees do not know they are part of a debate about the origins of human warfare. They are simply living, in the way that the biology of their species and the social and ecological conditions of their habitat have shaped them to live. What that living reveals about the deepest questions of human nature is what the debate is about. Sleep well. The methodological challenge of studying chimpanzee intergroup violence is one of the dimensions of the debate that the scientific literature has engaged with honestly. The data on intergroup killing comes from communities that have been habituated to human observers, because unhabituated communities cannot be followed closely enough to document the behavioral events of the patrol and the attack. The habituation process requires years of human presence in the community's range, and the years of human presence required to achieve habituation are years during which the community's behavior is influenced by the human presence in ways that the researchers cannot fully control or account for. The circularity of the methodological situation is that the data required to understand the behavior can only be obtained through a process that may influence the behavior the data is intended to describe. The long-term nature of the research programs that have produced the killing data is both the greatest strength and one of the most important constraints of the dataset. The strength is that individual animals are known across their entire lifetimes. Their participation in patrols and attacks is documented across years of behavioral observation, and the social context of each behavioral event is known in the detail that only years of continuous monitoring can provide. The constraint is that the research programs have been present in the communities they monitor for the entire period of data collection, and the accumulation of decades of human presence may have effects on the community's behavior that are too subtle and too gradual to be detected by the within-site analyses that the research programs conduct. The genetic evidence that connects chimpanzee and human propensities for intergroup violence, which is the most direct way to address the homology versus analogy question, is evidence that the field of comparative genomics is beginning to produce but has not yet produced at the resolution and the comprehensiveness that the debate requires. The genes that regulate aggression, the genes that regulate the social cognition required for coalition formation, and the genes that regulate the fear and the vigilance responses that boundary encounters produce are all potential targets for a comparative genomics approach to the homology question. The identification of shared genetic variants between chimpanzees and humans in these regulatory systems would be evidence for the homology interpretation. The absence of such sharing would be evidence against it. The current state of the comparative genomics of aggression in great apes is not yet at the point where this evidence can be assessed with the precision the question requires. The female behavior in the context of the debate about why chimpanzees kill is a dimension that the literature has addressed less systematically than the male behavior, despite its importance for understanding the evolutionary logic of the killing. The adaptive hypothesis proposes that the killing produces reproductive benefits that accrue primarily to the males who do the killing through the territorial expansion that successful killing produces and the increased reproductive opportunities that expanded territory provides. But the females of the expanding community are the individuals whose reproductive success is most directly increased by the territorial expansion, because the expansion provides additional foraging resources to the females whose home ranges are in the areas adjacent to the newly acquired territory. The females are the beneficiaries of the killing in the currency of reproductive success, even though they are not the perpetrators. Understanding their role in the system is part of understanding the system as a whole, and the research on female behavioral responses to intergroup competition is an underdeveloped area of the literature relative to its importance for the adaptive interpretation. The question of what distinguishes the chimpanzee's intergroup violence from the intergroup violence of other animals is relevant to the debate about the evolutionary origins of human warfare. Because if the chimpanzee's behavior is simply a version of the territorial competition that is widespread across animal taxa, then its significance for understanding human warfare is different from what it would be if the behavior is distinctive to the chimpanzee lineage in ways that reflect the shared cognitive architecture of chimpanzees and humans. The comparison with other animals that show lethal intergroup competition, including ants, wolves, and several primate species other than chimpanzees, illuminates the features of the chimpanzee's behavior that are shared across taxa and the features that are distinctive to the chimpanzee. The coalition formation, the assessment of numerical advantage, the targeting of lone individuals rather than engaging groups, and the territorial motivation are features that appear across multiple taxa that show lethal intergroup competition. The complexity of the social cognition required to implement these behavioral strategies is a feature that may be distinctive to the chimpanzee and human lineages. The research on stress responses in chimpanzees during intergroup encounters, which has been conducted through the non-invasive sampling of cortisol levels in urine and feces from individuals at different stages of intergroup encounter contexts, has produced findings that illuminate the physiological dimension of the behavior in ways that the behavioral data alone cannot. The elevated cortisol levels that chimpanzees show during patrol activities compared to ordinary foraging activities are consistent with the elevated physiological arousal that the behavioral description of the patrol suggests, and they provide a physiological correlate of the behavioral transition from the ordinary foraging state to the patrol state that is independent of the behavioral observations themselves. The cortisol data is one of the lines of evidence that the adaptive interpretation has incorporated to support the claim that the patrol is a behaviorally and physiologically distinct state, rather than simply an ordinary ranging activity that happens to take the community toward the boundary zone. The archival value of the long-term behavioral datasets from Gombe, Kibale, Tai, and the other research sites where chimpanzee intergroup violence has been documented is a value that extends beyond the current debate about the evolutionary origins of human warfare. These datasets contain the behavioral records of individual animals across their entire lifetimes, and the richness of the individual-level behavioral data that they preserve is a resource for answering questions about chimpanzee behavioral biology that have not yet been asked, as well as for answering the questions that the current debate is focused on. The individuals whose killing behavior is recorded in these datasets are known individuals with names and histories and social relationships that are part of the research record. The behavioral science that has produced this record is one of the most significant contributions to the understanding of great ape social life that the 20th century produced, and its significance extends to the questions about human evolutionary history that the records illuminate, as well as to the questions about chimpanzee behavior that motivated their collection. The relationship between the within-community dominance hierarchy and the intergroup killing behavior is one of the dimensions of the phenomenon that the research has documented most consistently across sites. The alpha male's role in organizing and leading the patrol is documented at every site where the behavior has been studied in enough detail to characterize individual roles within the patrol group. The alpha male's decision to advance or to withdraw, made on the basis of his assessment of the numerical and positional situation at the boundary, is the decision that most directly determines whether a patrol becomes a lethal attack. The alpha who advances when the situation is unfavorable risks his own life and the lives of the males who follow him. The alpha who withdraws when the situation is favorable forgoes a territorial opportunity that the adaptive hypothesis predicts would increase the community's reproductive success. The selection pressure on the alpha's decision-making in the intergroup competitive context is therefore selection pressure on the cognitive capabilities that allow accurate assessment of the numerical and situational information available at the boundary zone. The question that this video opened with, "Why do chimpanzees kill each other?" does not have a single answer that the current state of the science can definitively provide. The adaptive hypothesis proposes that the killing is maintained in the population because it produces territorial benefits that translate into reproductive success, and the evidence from the 2014 cross-site analysis and from the Ngogo territorial expansion case supports this interpretation. The disruption hypothesis proposes that the killing is elevated by the conditions of the research sites and would be lower or absent in genuinely undisturbed populations, and the methodological impossibility of studying genuinely undisturbed populations means that this hypothesis cannot be definitively excluded. And the cultural transmission hypothesis proposes that the killing is a learned behavior transmitted across generations within communities, maintained not by genetic predisposition alone, but by the social learning processes that transmit complex behavioral patterns in great apes. The science that the debate has produced is better science than would have been produced in the absence of the debate. The demand for more data, more rigorous analysis, and more clearly specified theoretical predictions that the critics of the adaptive hypothesis have produced has driven the adaptive hypothesis researchers to conduct exactly the kind of cross-site comparative analysis that the 2014 paper represents. And the critique of that analysis has driven further refinements in the dataset and the methodology that continue to improve the evidence base from which the question is being answered. The scientific debate about why chimpanzees kill each other is a model of how a productive scientific controversy should work, and the understanding of chimpanzee intergroup violence that has emerged from it is substantially more detailed, more rigorous, and more honest about its limitations than the understanding that any single research program or theoretical framework alone would have produced. The forests where the debate is being conducted, in the behavioral sense that the chimpanzees whose behavior is the subject of the debate are conducting it, are forests that are themselves under pressure from the same human activities that have shaped the competitive landscape of the chimpanzee communities that live in them. The habitat loss and fragmentation that have reduced the total area of chimpanzee habitat across West and Central Africa over the last century have created conditions in which chimpanzee communities are increasingly compressed into smaller and more isolated habitat patches, with fewer options for territorial expansion and greater intensity of intergroup competition in the areas where communities remain. The debate about whether human disturbance elevates chimpanzee intergroup violence is a debate that is occurring in the context of a much larger and much less controlled human disturbance of the chimpanzee's world, and the conservation implications of that disturbance are not separate from the scientific questions the debate is addressing. The chimpanzees who are alive tonight in the forests of Africa have no relationship to the debate about why they do what they do. They are patrolling their boundaries, assessing their competitors, and making the behavioral decisions that the available evidence and their accumulated experience support. The science that has been trying to understand these decisions for 50 years has produced a body of knowledge that is simultaneously more detailed and more contested than it was when the first lethal attack was observed at Gombe in 1974. The detail is the product of 50 years of careful observation and rigorous analysis. The contestation is the product of the genuine difficulty of the questions that the observations have raised, and of the stakes that the answers carry for our understanding of who we are and where we came from. The chimpanzees do not share this stake. They are simply living the lives that the biology of their species and the conditions of their habitat have shaped them to live in the forests that have been their home for longer than our species has existed to wonder about them. Sleep well. The bonobo, who shares this channel's extended attention with the chimpanzee in the series that this video is part of, provides the most important comparative data point in the debate about why chimpanzees kill each other. Not because the bonobo answers the question directly, but because the bonobo's absence of intergroup killing raises the question of what is different between the two species that produces such a dramatically different outcome in the domain of intergroup violence. The two species share approximately 99.6% of their genomes. They share the same basic social organization. They share the same cognitive architecture, at least at the level of resolution that the comparative cognitive research has been able to characterize. And yet one kills and the other does not. What the 0.4% of genomic difference and the ecological difference between the Congo Basin and the rest of the chimpanzee's range have produced, in terms of the behavioral difference between the two species in the domain of intergroup violence, is one of the most important questions in comparative primatology. The debate about why chimpanzees kill each other is, at its deepest level, a debate about what that difference is. Sleep well. The 3 videos in this series on chimpanzee warfare have tried to approach the same behavioral phenomenon from 3 different angles. The first video told the story of the 4-year war at Gombe, the documented history of the behavior, and the research that has established its reality and its consistency across populations. The second video tried to convey what witnessing a chimpanzee raid would actually look like, from the perspective of a researcher following the males through a dark forest in the hours before dawn. And this video has tried to convey the scientific debate that the behavior has generated, the competing theoretical frameworks that researchers have applied to the data, and the stakes that the debate carries for the deepest questions about the relationship between chimpanzee and human social behavior. Three angles on the same behavior, each illuminating a different dimension of what the science has produced and what the behavior means. The chimpanzee communities at the research sites, where the long-term behavioral data has been collected, are communities that have been under observation for between 30 and 60 years. The individual animals in these communities span multiple generations of observation, and the behavioral records of the oldest individuals extend across a substantial fraction of the research program's history. What the research programs have produced across these decades of observation is not simply a data set of behavioral events. It is a record of social lives, of individuals navigating the social and competitive dynamics of their communities across years and decades, of communities changing their composition and their competitive relationships over time, and of a behavioral system whose logic and whose consequences have become increasingly visible as the length of the observation record has grown. The understanding of why chimpanzees kill each other is not a question that a short-term study can answer. It is a question that the long-term programs were built to address, and that they are still addressing, patrol by patrol, killing by killing, year by year, in the forests where the behavior continues. Sleep well. The researchers who are conducting this work are not simply data collectors. They are people who have spent years or decades in these forests, following the same individuals, building the kind of knowledge of individual behavioral histories and social relationships that only continuous long-term presence in a field site can produce. The quality of that knowledge is not fully captured in the data sets that the research programs publish, because the data sets contain the behavioral events, but not the full context of individual lives and social relationships that gives the events meaning. The published accounts from researchers who have spent the most time in these forests convey something of that context, and the reading of those accounts produces a picture of the chimpanzees at these sites that is richer and more individual than the statistical summaries of behavioral rates and frequencies that the datasets provide. The debate about why chimpanzees kill each other is a debate about what the statistical summaries mean. The accounts of the researchers who have known these individuals for decades are part of what the statistics are summaries of. Sleep well. The night falls on the forests where the debate is unresolved and where the behavior continues. The chimpanzees at Gombe and Kibale and Tai are in their nests, the patrols of the day concluded, the social interactions of the community completed for the time being. The researchers who have spent this day in the field are writing their notes, adding to the data sets that the debate is conducted with, contributing one more day's observations to the long-term records that the science depends on. Tomorrow the males will wake and resume the social and competitive activities that the research programs are documenting. Some days will produce patrols, some patrols will produce contacts, some contacts will produce killings. The behavior is real, consistent, and occurring right now in forests that extend far beyond the boundaries of the research programs that have documented it. The question of why it occurs is a question that the science has not yet definitively answered. The research that will eventually answer it is being conducted in these forests by the researchers whose field notes are the raw material from which the answer will be built. Sleep well. The scale of the scientific community engaged with the question of why chimpanzees kill each other is worth noting, because it reflects the degree to which the question is recognized as important beyond the narrow community of primatologists who study chimpanzee behavior. The 2014 Nature paper had 29 authors, representing research programs at 18 different study sites. The commentary and response literature that it generated involved researchers from behavioral ecology, evolutionary biology, anthropology, and the comparative psychology of animal cognition. The interdisciplinary engagement with the question reflects the interdisciplinary significance of the answer, because the question of whether chimpanzee intergroup killing is adaptive, ancestral, and shared with the human lineage is a question whose answer matters for understanding human social evolution in ways that extend far beyond primatology. The data from the bonobo research programs that has been accumulated at the sites in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the intergroup encounters of bonobo communities have been documented in the same detail, that the chimpanzee encounter data has been documented at the East and West African sites is data that the adaptive hypothesis must accommodate. The bonobo communities at the Wamba and Luikotali research sites have been observed in many intergroup encounters, and none of these encounters has produced a lethal attack. The affiliative and socio-sexual interactions that the encounters have produced instead illuminate the social mechanisms through which the bonobo manages intergroup tensions without the lethal violence that characterizes chimpanzee intergroup encounters. Whether these mechanisms are the product of the bonobo's ecological context, as the adaptive hypothesis predicts, or of some deeper cognitive or emotional difference between the two species, is a question that the comparative research is still working to answer. The final question that this series on chimpanzee warfare has been building toward is the question that the debate is ultimately about. What does the chimpanzee's intergroup killing reveal about human nature? The honest answer is that it reveals something, but not everything, and that what it reveals depends on which theoretical framework best explains the behavior. If the adaptive hypothesis is correct, then the tendency toward coalition-based lethal intergroup violence is part of the evolutionary heritage that the human lineage shares with the chimpanzee lineage, and the behavioral psychology of human warfare has evolutionary roots that predate the emergence of the human species. If the disruption hypothesis is correct, then the chimpanzee killing behavior at research sites is an elevated artifact of the research conditions, and the true baseline rate of chimpanzee intergroup killing in undisturbed populations is unknown. And if the cultural transmission hypothesis is correct, then the killing is a learned behavioral pattern that varies between communities and populations, and whose presence or absence in any given community reflects the social learning history of that community rather than a fixed behavioral tendency. The chimpanzees in the forest tonight are not waiting for the debate to be resolved. They are doing what they do in the forests that contain them, in the social communities that shape them, and in the competitive landscape that their behavior is continuously producing and responding to. The debate that their behavior has generated is a human debate, conducted in the language of science, by the people who have dedicated their careers to understanding what the chimpanzees are doing and why. The understanding that the debate has produced is genuine and important. The understanding that it has not yet produced is also genuine and important. The science continues in the forests and in the literature, patrol by patrol and paper by paper, working toward the answer to the question that Geza Teleki's observation in 1974 made impossible to ignore. Sleep well. The sociological dimension of the scientific debate, which involves the career stakes and the ideological commitments of the researchers on each side, is a dimension that the science itself does not address, but that is visible to anyone who reads the literature with attention. The researchers who have devoted their careers to the long-term behavioral programs at Gombe and Kibale have a professional investment in the validity of the data those programs have produced, and the interpretation of that data as reflecting genuine chimpanzee behavioral tendencies rather than research artifacts is an interpretation that supports the value of the programs whose data the interpretation is based on. The researchers who have proposed the disruption hypothesis have their own theoretical commitments and professional investments, and the critique of the adaptive interpretation reflects in part a disagreement about the theory of evolution and human nature that the adaptive interpretation implies. Science does not happen outside of human social contexts, and the debate about why chimpanzees kill each other is a scientific debate that is also a debate about ideas and values that extend far beyond the behavioral data of chimpanzee communities. The 3 videos in this series have covered the discovery of chimpanzee intergroup killing, the experience of witnessing it, and the scientific debate about its meaning. What they have not covered, because the science has not yet produced it, is a final answer to the question the series opened with: why do chimpanzees kill each other? The honest answer, at the current state of the science, is that the behavior is real and consistent, that it correlates with the territorial and reproductive variables that the adaptive hypothesis predicts, that it may be elevated at research sites relative to undisturbed populations in ways that cannot be fully assessed with the available data, and that its relationship to human intergroup violence is a question that the behavioral evidence supports asking, but cannot fully answer. That is where the science is. The forests where the behavior continues are there, being monitored by the research programs that have produced the understanding described in this series. The monitoring will continue, the understanding will develop, and the chimpanzees will continue to do what they do in the forests that contain them, for reasons that the science is still working to fully understand. Sleep well. The research programs that have produced the data that the debate is conducted with are programs that require sustained institutional support, sustained field staff, and sustained political relationships with the governments of the countries where the research is conducted, to maintain the decades of continuous presence that long-term behavioral research requires. The programs at Gombe and Kibale have been running for more than 50 years, and the continuity of their data sets across that time is a product of the institutional structures and the individual commitments that have kept the programs operational through the political and economic disruptions that the countries where they operate have experienced. The value of these data sets is not just scientific, it is historical. They preserve a record of chimpanzee social life across a period of dramatic environmental change, and the comparison between the behavioral data from the early years of each program and the behavioral data from the most recent years is beginning to reveal how chimpanzee behavior is changing as the forests that contain it are changing. The killing data is one component of that larger record, and its significance will increase as the record lengthens. The question of what the science of chimpanzee intergroup violence will look like in another 50 years is a question that depends on developments in the science that cannot be predicted from its current state. The genomic tools that will allow the comparison of the aggression-related gene variants between chimpanzees and humans at the resolution required to address the homology question are tools that are still being developed. The neuroimaging tools that will allow the comparison of the neural circuits for social cognition and threat assessment between chimpanzees and humans in ways that illuminate the cognitive substrate of the behavior are tools that are being developed in the human neuroscience literature, and that will eventually be adapted for great ape research. And the long-term behavioral data sets from the research programs will continue to grow, adding years of observation to the records that already extend across 50 years, and that will eventually span the full lifetimes of multiple generations of individuals in the monitored communities. What the science will understand about why chimpanzees kill each other in 50 years is something that the current state of the science cannot fully anticipate. What it will have is more data, better tools, and the understanding that those will produce. Sleep well.